So it's a dual folded concern, I would say, because localization has been introduced in two different rules. One of them is a broad localization, which could be applicable to simply any entity, as long as the government feels that there is a justification for that. So essentially, it's Rule 12, and one of them is 12.4. Yeah, so one of them is 12.4, and the other one is under Rule, I think, 8. I think it's 8. I just want to refer to the specific provision. 14, sorry, yeah. 14. So 14 is essentially a very general data localization provision, and the applicability of this would be across all data fiduciaries. The reason this provision specifically is of concern is because it has been issued under a section of the Act which only identified that data localization will not be required except to countries that may be notified by the government. So what the industry was expecting is that there will be free flow of data and there will be some restricted country list which the government of India will notify in the future. Now, instead of coming up with the list, what Rule 14 has done is essentially they have introduced a very broad criteria. And what it says is that if the government of India is of the view that certain kind of data is accessible to a foreign government or any agency of a foreign state, then that could be subject to additional data localization criteria. So this is, of course, of concern because data localization traditionally has been subject to a lot of debate. To what extent it really helps, the government of India, that has been a subject of debate. For example, there have been many studies on the fact that having localized data is quite contrary to the interest of having a cyber secure environment. Because if you are trying to protect yourself against cyber threats, you definitely do not want all Indian data to be localized in India. One of the primary components of having a very robust cybersecurity policy is that companies and cybersecurity experts, they keep routing data so that it's not very susceptible to cyber threats. So that is, one very technical concern that the industry has been proposing to the government. Then there are additional concerns. You will have to invest in data centers and local hosting in India. Companies will not be able to route and track data the way that they ordinarily do. They'll need to have a separate India policy. And a more geopolitical concern by a lot of BPOs, etc., is that Indian companies who are doing business abroad, there could be pushback in data localization requirements under those jurisdictions simply because, India is requiring that. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. And as I mentioned, the question of whether or not it's even permitted to come up with a rule like this under the scope of the original section, that itself is also something that has been a topic of discussion. And the second localization is more interesting because under Rule 12.4, they have essentially introduced a localization provision that could be applicable to significant data fiduciaries. As of right now, we don't know who these entities will be, but because it's dependent on the kind of data, the quantity of data that they are processing. However, what the government has said is that there will be a committee, and that committee may decide that as part of additional obligations, some SDFs will need to ensure that the data is based in India. So now the concern with that is that they are talking about some kind of data set. So what we can expect is in the future, when SDF's criteria is established, there could be some directive or some order basis which some kind of data set that these SDFs are processing that could be mandated to be localized in India. However, interestingly, this provision also talks about the fact that the personal data and the traffic pertaining to that data, that will also be localized. This has been subject matter of debate because traffic data is arguably not personal data. It is non-personal data because, traffic data, an example of that is what kind of messages, what was the proportion and the frequency of messages originating from Delhi from this date to this date, what area were the messages. So it's more demographic data and it's more pattern-based data. Now, this kind of data is not within the scope of this act at all because, DPDP is a personal data regulation. So people have been concerned that how exactly can, the government regulate and mandate localization of non-personal data under this provision and whether it's even permitted under the section of the law. So as I said, I hotly debated topic. A lot of issues here.